Story 1: The Wilderness Guide and the Unhinged Client. The wilderness has always been my sanctuary, a place of raw beauty, isolation, and quiet reflection. For nearly a decade, I've guided people into these untamed lands, helping them rediscover the primal connection between humanity and nature. But that connection can be fragile. And sometimes, the forest doesn't bring peace. It whispers danger. I still remember the morning vividly. The sky was heavy with clouds, the air cool and damp from a recent rain, and I was preparing my gear for a solo trek. Then he arrived, a man disheveled and pale. His clothes mismatched as if he'd dressed in a hurry. He looked out of place, like a city dweller lost in the untamed wild. Something was off about him, but I ignored the knot in my stomach. He was a last-minute booking, and I was his guide. His money had been paid, my duty was clear. Yet, as the day unfolded, I realized there are things in the wilderness more dangerous than wild animals or treacherous trails. By the time I understood the true peril, it was too late to turn back. What would you do if you were alone in the forest with someone whose sanity was slipping away? Would you stay? Or would you run? The trail wound its way through thick woods, the earth damp beneath our boots and the occasional bird call breaking the stillness. At first, the man was silent, trudging along behind me without a word. That suited me fine. Some clients liked to chatter, but I preferred the ones who appreciated the solitude of nature. But this man, something about him unsettled me. It wasn't just his appearance, the pale skin, the two wide eyes, it was the way he moved. He'd stop suddenly, his head snapping to the side as if he'd heard something I couldn't. Once, I turned to ask if he was okay, only to find him staring into the trees. When I followed his gaze, there was nothing but shadows. As the hours passed, his behavior grew stranger. He began muttering under his breath, the words too low for me to catch. And occasionally, he'd glance over his shoulder. At first, I thought he was nervous, plenty of first-time hikers are, but this was different. His agitation seemed deeper, almost primal. "Are you sure you're okay?" I asked during a break, trying to keep my tone casual. He nodded, but his hands were shaking, and his eyes darted toward the trail behind us. "Something's following us," he whispered. I turned to look, my heart skipping a beat. There was nothing, only trees and the empty trail. "It's just your imagination," I said, trying to reassure him, though I wasn't entirely sure myself. We pressed on, but his paranoia was contagious. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, felt amplified. The forest, once my sanctuary, now felt oppressive. The shadows deeper and the silence louder. By the time we reached a small clearing, the man was barely holding it together. His eyes darted from side to side, his breathing shallow. I suggested we rest, hoping it would calm him. Instead, he stood at the edge of the clearing, staring into the woods with such intensity that it sent a shiver down my spine. It happened so suddenly that I barely had time to comprehend it. One moment, he was a trembling figure at the edge of the clearing, the next, he lunged at me with a guttural scream that sent a shockwave of terror through my body. His face was distorted with unrecognizable emotion, a mix of terror and unhinged rage. His hands, claw-like and trembling, reached for me as though driven by some primal instinct. I stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding his grasp, and felt my boot catch on a root. I hit the ground hard, The breath knocked out of me. But I forced myself to scramble away as he loomed over me, his shadow blocking out the faint sunlight. "You have to see it," he shrieked, his voice raw and broken. "It's in the trees. It's watching us." My heart pounded like a war drum as I tried to reason with him. "There's nothing there. Please. Calm down," I gasped, raising a hand to shield myself. But there was no reasoning with him. His gaze darted wildly between me and the shadowy treetops as though he were caught between two worlds, one visible and one unseen. He grabbed at me again, and I rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding his grasp. I scrambled to my feet, scanning the clearing for anything I could use. My pack was too far away, and I had left my knife buried beneath layers of gear. My eyes locked onto a sturdy branch nearby, and I lunged for it, my fingers curling around its rough bark just as he rushed me again. "Get back!" I shouted, swinging the branch in a wide arc. The branch connected with his shoulder, the impact forcing him to stagger back. But it didn't stop him. His scream tore through the air, feral and guttural, echoing off the trees like a twisted symphony. And then, just for a moment, he froze, his head tilted sharply, his eyes fixed on something behind me. I turned, my stomach knotting, and saw nothing but the dense woods, the shifting shadows, and the swaying branches. "It's here," he whispered, his voice dropping to a trembling rasp. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed for me to run. But something in his tone held me in place. His wide eyes seemed to pierce through the underbrush, locked onto something invisible to me. My breath hitched as the forest seemed to grow colder, the air heavy with an oppressive silence that pressed against my ears. I turned back to him, and that's when he lunged again. This time, I wasn't quick enough. His hands locked around my wrist with surprising strength, his nails digging into my skin. "You don't understand," he yelled, his face inches from mine. His breath was hot and sour, his grip unyielding. "It's going to take us both." Adrenaline surged through me, and I twisted violently, wrenching my arm free. The branch fell from my grasp, and I stumbled backward, my boots skidding on the damp leaves. He advanced, his movements erratic and jerky, as though he were a puppet with frayed strings. I backed into the tree line, my mind racing. If I ran, he might catch me. If I stayed, I had no idea what he was capable of. Then my eyes landed on a large rock half buried in the earth. I didn't think, I just acted. Ducking low, I grabbed the rock with both hands and swung it up in a desperate arc as he lunged again. The makeshift weapon struck him in the chest, knocking the wind out of him, and he crumpled to the ground, gasping. But it wasn't over. As he lay there, clutching his chest, his body convulsed in strange spasms, his eyes rolled back, and a guttural, inhuman noise escaped his throat. I took a cautious step back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Then he laughed. The sound was low and guttural at first, but it grew louder, more maniacal. He rolled onto his side, his laughter echoing through the trees, sending chills down my spine. "You don't get it, do you?" he rasped, his voice cracking with hysteria. "It's not just me. It's the forest. It's in the air. It's in you now." The words hit me like a blow. I didn't know if he was delusional or if there was something more sinister at play. All I knew was that I couldn't stay any longer. He staggered to his feet as I turned and ran, his laughter following me like a ghost through the woods. My legs burned. My lungs screamed for air. But I didn't dare stop. The trees seemed to close in around me, the trail twisting and turning in ways I didn't recognize. Behind me, the sounds of his pursuit faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the branches. But his words echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I finally burst out onto the gravel road, I collapsed, gasping for breath. My body trembled, and my vision blurred. But I forced myself to look back. The forest was still. But in the distance, where the trail disappeared into the trees, I thought I saw a shadow move, something tall and dark, watching. And then it was gone. When I finally burst out of the forest onto the gravel road, I collapsed, my body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. The man's screams had faded, but his wild eyes were burned into my memory. Back at headquarters, I recounted the ordeal to the senior guide, my voice hoarse and shaky. I expected shock or alarm, but instead, he simply nodded, his expression grim. "It's not uncommon," he said, his voice heavy. "The wilderness can break people. Some come out here looking for peace, but they find something else entirely." I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but I was too drained. That night, as I lay in my bunk, the forest seemed darker than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, lost in his own madness. What had he seen in those trees? What had driven him to the brink? The wilderness holds many secrets, and some are better left undiscovered. If you were me, would you go back into those woods? Or would you let the forest keep its dark mysteries? Story 2: The German Hiker and the Ridge. The forest, with its vast, untamed beauty, has always been my refuge. As a guide, I've spent years leading others into its depths, showing them a world untouched by time. But even the most experienced among us can't prepare for the unknown. Some places hold secrets too ancient, too powerful to comprehend. It began on a cold October morning. A last-minute client, a German man in his mid-50s, had requested a private hike to a remote ridge. His name was Dietrich, and there was nothing remarkable about his appearance: average height, brown hair streaked with gray, dressed in practical hiking gear. But from the moment we met, he unsettled me. Dietrich wasn't just quiet, he was distant, as though his mind was elsewhere. When he spoke, his words carried a weight I couldn't quite place. He had no interest in the typical allure of the wilderness, the vibrant fall leaves, the crisp mountain air, or the sweeping vistas. No, his focus lay entirely on the ridge, a place I rarely visited because of its remoteness and the strange stories locals told. By the end of that day, I'd realize why the ridge had such a reputation. What Dietrich sought there would change him, and me, forever. The trail began innocuously enough, winding through a dense forest of towering pines and oaks. The morning was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. As we walked, Dietrich remained close behind me, his boots crunching rhythmically on the path. At first, I tried to engage him in conversation, a habit I'd developed over years of guiding. Most clients enjoyed sharing their reasons for venturing into the wilderness, whether it was for solace, adventure, or a challenge. But Dietrich was different. When I asked why he wanted to visit the ridge, his response was clipped: "It is important." I pressed no further. though his answer left me uneasy. Something about his tone suggested he wasn't here for leisure or exploration. The deeper we trekked into the forest, the more peculiar his behavior became. He'd stop suddenly, his head tilted as though listening to something I couldn't hear. When I asked if everything was all right, he'd nod briefly and motion for us to continue. At one point, he murmured, "It's quieter than I expected." "What's quieter?" I asked, glancing around at the silent woods. He didn't answer. By midday, the forest seemed to change. The vibrant yellows and oranges of autumn faded into muted grays, the trees growing denser, their gnarled branches intertwining above us like a skeletal canopy. Even the air felt different, heavier, colder, as if the forest itself was alive and watching. Dietrich's demeanor only added to the unease. His gaze frequently drifted toward the treetops, his lips moving as though in prayer or incantation. At one point, he paused to run his fingers over the rough bark of an ancient oak, whispering something in German. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice breaking the stillness. He nodded, but his eyes didn't meet mine. As we climbed higher, the trail grew steeper and more treacherous. The forest thinned, and the wind picked up, howling through the ridgeline like a mournful wail. Dietrich seemed unfazed, his pace steady, his focus unwavering. It was as though he knew exactly where he was going, despite having hired me as his guide. When we finally reached the base of the ridge, he stopped. The jagged rocks loomed ahead, their shadows stretching long in the late afternoon light. "This is where I go alone," he said, his voice calm but firm. I hesitated. "The ridge can be dangerous," I warned. "It's easy to lose your footing up there." He gave me a small, almost pitying smile. "I will manage." Reluctantly, I agreed. I watched as he ascended, his figure growing smaller with each step. He moved with a deliberate precision, as if drawn by an unseen force. Dietrich's descent from the ridge was anything but steady. His earlier confidence, the deliberate precision with which he had climbed, was gone. His legs wobbled, his movements erratic, like a man battling invisible forces. When he finally reached me, his face was ashen, his lips trembling as if forming words he couldn't bear to speak. "We need to leave," he said again. But this time his voice cracked, a tremor betraying the fear lurking beneath his calm facade. "What happened up there?" I asked, gripping his arm. "You need to tell me." He yanked his arm free with surprising strength, his wide eyes locking onto mine. "No questions. Just move." Before I could respond, he took off down the trail, his strides uneven but urgent. Something about his tone struck a chord of primal fear deep within me. Against my better judgment, I followed. The trail back was unrecognizable. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the remaining light was a dull, gray haze that seemed to drain the life from everything around us. The trees, which had once towered majestically, now loomed like twisted sentinels, their branches reaching out as if trying to ensnare us. The wind picked up, carrying with it a low, mournful sound that didn't quite seem natural. It wasn't the howl of the breeze through the trees, it was deeper, almost guttural, like the strained exhale of something vast and unseen. "Keep your eyes forward," Dietrich said sharply. I wanted to question him, to demand answers, but the dread in his voice silenced me. Still, curiosity clawed at my mind. urging me to glance over my shoulder. I resisted, focusing instead on the narrow path ahead. Then the noises began. At first, it was subtle, a soft rustling in the underbrush, too deliberate to be the wind. Then came the crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. The sound seemed to circle us, moving swiftly through the trees, always just beyond sight. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Dietrich didn't respond. He was muttering under his breath in German, his words frantic and disjointed. "Dietrich," I hissed, grabbing his shoulder. He stopped abruptly, his head snapping toward me. His face was a mask of terror, sweat glistening on his forehead despite the chill in the air. "Don't stop," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's close." "What's close?" I demanded, my own voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began walking again. Faster this time. The noises grew louder. Closer. Whatever was out there, it wasn't trying to hide anymore. The heavy thud of footsteps echoed through the forest, accompanied by the sound of something large brushing against the branches. It wasn't just following us, it was hunting us. "Run," Dietrich said suddenly. "What?" "Run," he shouted. And this time, I didn't question him. We took off down the trail, our boots pounding against the dirt. The forest seemed to come alive around us, the shadows shifting and writhing as if they had a will of their own. The sounds of pursuit were deafening now, branches snapping, leaves crunching, something massive crashing through the trees. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it, something looming, something immense and unnatural, its presence pressing down on me like a physical weight. The trail twisted sharply, and Dietrich nearly slipped as he rounded the corner. I reached out instinctively, steadying him, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. The fear in his gaze was something I'd never seen before, something primal and all-consuming. "This isn't right," I gasped, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Keep moving," he barked, pulling me forward. We burst into a small clearing, the moonlight spilling down like a pale spotlight. For a moment, the noises stopped, the forest falling deathly silent. I bent over, gasping for air, my legs trembling beneath me. Dietrich stood rigid, his eyes scanning the tree line. "It's still here," he whispered. What's out there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned to me, his face pale and drawn. "We can't stop. Not here. It won't let us." Before I could process his words, the air around us seemed to shift. A low, resonant hum filled the clearing, vibrating in my chest like the distant rumble of thunder. The shadows at the edge of the clearing deepened, pooling together as if drawn by some unseen force. Then I saw it, or at least, I thought I did. A shape, massive and indistinct, moving between the trees. It wasn't entirely solid, its form flickering in and out of focus like a mirage. But its eyes, two pinpricks of burning light, were unmistakable, locked onto us with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "Go!" Dietrich shouted, shoving me toward the opposite edge of the clearing. I didn't need to be told twice. We ran, the hum growing louder, the shadows surging forward like a tide. My mind raced, every rational thought drowned out by the primal instinct to survive. The trail blurred beneath my feet, the trees whipping past in a haze of black and gray. The noises were deafening now, the roar of something vast and ancient. Its presence pressing against my senses like a physical force. When we finally stumbled out onto the gravel road, the oppressive weight lifted instantly. The noises ceased, the forest falling into an eerie stillness. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, my entire body trembling. Dietrich stood a few feet away, staring back at the tree line. His face was pale, his hands clenched into fists. "What was that?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. After a long moment, he turned to me, his expression grim. "You should never go back there," he said quietly. Then he walked away, leaving me alone with the suffocating silence and 1,000 unanswered questions. We reached the trailhead just as the last light of day faded. Dietrich didn't say a word as he climbed into his car and drove away, leaving me standing there, shaken and alone. 4 weeks. I couldn't shake the unease. The forest, once my refuge, now felt oppressive. I avoided the ridge, the memory of that day lingering like a shadow at the edge of my thoughts. Then, one evening, 2 men in suits arrived at my door. "Are you, name?" the taller one asked, flashing an FBI badge. "Yes," I said cautiously. "We need to ask you about a man named Dietrich." My heart sank. I invited them in, and they questioned me for hours about the hike, about Dietrich's behavior, about what he might have done on the ridge. Their questions were cryptic, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. "What's going on?" I finally asked. The agents exchanged a glance. "That's classified," one said. "But we recommend you avoid that area for the foreseeable future." They left me with more questions than answers. What had Dietrich found on the ridge? What had drawn him there? The forest holds its secrets tightly, and some are better left undiscovered. But sometimes, those secrets find you anyway. Story 3: The Flute in the Woods. The forest at night has always held a certain allure, a dark, quiet world shrouded in mystery, where the imagination runs wild. For Emma and Jake, it was their favorite place to escape the monotony of life, to find solace under a canopy of stars. But the woods that night weren't the haven they expected. They would discover that some melodies don't soothe the soul, they summon something far more sinister. It started at 3 a.m., a time when the world felt asleep and untouched. They wandered a familiar trail, their flashlights casting long, flickering shadows among the trees. The air was still, the silence profound, until it wasn't. A single, haunting note drifted through the trees, a flute's melody, slow and melancholic. At first, it seemed harmless, even beautiful. But as it echoed through the forest, it grew louder, more insistent, as though it was searching for them. "Do you hear that?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. Jake nodded, his grip tightening on the flashlight. "It's coming closer." By the end of that night, they'd be running for their lives, desperate to escape a sound that refused to let them go. Would you have stayed to listen? Or would you have run at the first note? The first note hung in the air for what felt like an eternity, reverberating through the stillness. Emma and Jake stopped in their tracks, their flashlights illuminating only trees and underbrush. "It's probably someone camping," Jake said, though his tone lacked conviction. Emma frowned, straining to locate the source. The melody resumed, this time a series of slow, Deliberate notes that floated through the darkness like whispers. It wasn't an ordinary tune. Each note seemed to carry an unspoken weight. A mournful longing that sent chills racing down their spines. "Camping? At this hour?" Emma asked. Her voice barely audible. Jake shrugged. But his eyes darted nervously through the trees. "Let's just keep going. It's probably nothing." They walked on. Their pace quicker now. But the flute followed. The sound didn't fade with distance, if anything. It grew louder. As though the unseen player was moving with them. The trail, once so familiar, now felt alien. The trees seemed taller, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. Shadows danced at the edges of their flashlight beams. And the air grew colder, biting at their exposed skin. The melody shifted, faster now. More erratic. As if the unseen musician had grown impatient. Then it stopped altogether. Emma and Jake froze. Their breaths visible in the icy air. The silence was deafening. Pressing against their ears like a physical weight. "Where did it go?" Emma whispered. Her voice trembling. Jake shook his head. Scanning the forest. Maybe they stopped. A sudden rustling from the bushes cut him off. They both turned. Their flashlights catching only the barest flicker of movement, a shadow too fast and too large to be a deer or any familiar animal. "Did you see that?" Emma gasped. Her heart pounding. "Yeah," Jake muttered, gripping her arm. "Let's head back." They turned around, retracing their steps toward the main trail. But the forest seemed to shift around them. Landmarks they recognized moments ago were gone. Replaced by an endless stretch of trees that all looked the same. The flute began again. This time, it wasn't coming from one direction, it was everywhere. Surrounding them. The notes chimed from all sides. An otherworldly harmony that defied the laws of sound. "It's like it's in the trees," Emma said. Her voice rising in panic. Jake pulled her close. His flashlight swinging wildly. But there was no player. No source, only the relentless melody. Growing louder and louder. Emma and Jake's desperate dash to escape the haunting melody seemed endless. Their breaths ragged as the oppressive sound of the flute wrapped around them. Each note pierced the air like a dagger. Resonating in their chests and fraying their nerves. The trail, once familiar, had become a labyrinth. The trees seemed to shift. Their trunks closing ranks. And the path twisted in ways that defied memory. Jake's flashlight beam quivered with each step. Its light scattering across gnarled roots and damp leaves. Behind them, the shadows swirled. Alive with movement just out of sight. "Jake! It's not stopping!" Emma cried, clutching his arm. "I know," he shouted. His voice barely audible over the crescendoing flute. "Just keep going." The melody transformed again. Becoming sharp and erratic. It felt angry now. The once melancholic tune replaced by something feral. Almost predatory. The sound wasn't just chasing them, it was driving them. Herding them deeper into the forest. They burst into a clearing bathed in faint moonlight. Their hearts pounding as they stumbled to a halt. The music stopped. For a moment. There was only silence. The kind so thick it pressed against their ears. Emma's legs trembled. And she leaned against Jake. Trying to steady herself. "Did we lose it?" she whispered. Her voice barely audible. Jake shook his head. His eyes scanning the tree line. "I don't think it's something you lose." Then came the laughter. It started softly. A low chuckle that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The sound grew louder. More discordant. Echoing all around them. Emma turned in circles. Her flashlight sweeping across the trees. But there was no one there. "Who's there?" Jake shouted. His voice cracking. The laughter stopped abruptly. Replaced by the soft crunch of footsteps. Emma froze. Her grip on Jake tightening as the sound drew closer. From the darkness at the edge of the clearing. A figure emerged. It was tall and thin. Its limbs unnaturally long. And its face obscured by a hood. In one skeletal hand. It clutched a flute carved from something pale and uneven, bone. The figure stood motionless. Its presence radiating an unnatural stillness. Then it raised the flute to its lips. "No," Emma breathed. Her voice barely more than a whisper. The first note shattered the silence like glass. It wasn't music anymore, it was a scream. A wailing sound that pierced their ears and made their vision blur. Emma fell to her knees. Clutching her head as the sound twisted into something darker. Something alive. Jake grabbed her arm. Pulling her to her feet. "Run!" The figure didn't move. But the sound seemed to follow them as they stumbled back onto the trail. The trees shifted again. Their branches reaching down like skeletal fingers. Tearing at their clothes and hair. The flute's melody swirled around them. Coming from everywhere and nowhere. A cacophony that defied logic. "Where's the car?" Emma gasped. Tears streaming down her face. "Just keep going," Jake shouted. His own voice trembling with panic. The ground beneath them felt unstable. Each step sinking into the earth as though the forest itself were trying to trap them. The music grew louder. Its rhythm pounding in their chests like a second heartbeat. And then the shadows moved. A dozen shapes darted between the trees. Their forms fleeting but unmistakably human. Or almost human. Their movements were jerky. Unnatural. As if they were being pulled by invisible strings. "They're everywhere!" Emma screamed. Stumbling as one of the shadows crossed her path. Jake yanked her upright. His flashlight beam flickering wildly. "We have to keep going." But the trail had vanished. The trees closed in. Their trunks forming an impenetrable wall. The shadows surrounded them. Their glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. Emma clutched Jake. Her body trembling as the figures closed in. The flute's melody swelled. Its notes twisting into a haunting crescendo. "This isn't real," Jake muttered. Shaking his head. "It can't be real." The hooded figure stepped into the clearing once more. Its bone flute gleaming in the pale light. It raised the instrument to its lips. And the final note rang out, a sound so piercing. So unnatural. That it seemed to split the air itself. Emma screamed. The world around her dissolving into chaos. The shadows lunged. The forest spinning. And then... silence. The next day, Emma and Jake returned to the trailhead with a park ranger. Determined to find some explanation for what had happened. They scoured the woods. But there was no sign of the figure. No tracks. No flute. "It's probably just kids messing around," the ranger said. Though his tone lacked confidence. Emma and Jake knew better. The music. The shadowy figure. The forest that had come alive, it wasn't a prank. It was something older. Something that didn't belong to their world. Even now. Emma swears she can hear the faint notes of a flute when she closes her eyes. As though the melody is still searching for her. Story 4, The Haunting Hospital Shift. Hospitals are strange places at night. The daytime bustle fades, replaced by an eerie stillness. Hallways stretch into shadows, and the hum of machines becomes a background chorus to the occasional distant footsteps. For Claire, a pharmacy technician used to the graveyard shift, the quiet was part of the job. But this shift wasn't like the others. It began subtly, a creak of a door when no one was there. The faint sound of whispers echoing down an empty corridor. At first, Claire chalked it up to exhaustion. After all, long hours in fluorescent lighting could play tricks on anyone's mind. Then came the shadows. They darted just out of her sight, moving unnaturally fast. When she turned to look, the hallway would be empty, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The worst was the patient she swore she saw, a man in a hospital gown, drenched in blood, standing at the end of the hallway. His empty eyes met hers before he vanished. By the end of her shift, Claire would question everything she thought she knew about the hospital. Was she simply overworked? Or was something far more sinister sharing those sterile halls with her? What would you do if the dead lingered where you worked? Claire's shift started like any other, with the sterile scent of disinfectant greeting her as she walked into the pharmacy. The quiet was almost comforting. The hospital's chaotic daytime energy replaced by a hushed efficiency. Her tasks were routine, preparing prescriptions, double-checking dosages, and ensuring the nurses had everything they needed. She worked alone most nights, her small office tucked away from the main corridors. Occasionally, a nurse or doctor would drop by for a last-minute request. But for the most part, Claire had only the hum of the air conditioning for company. The first sign that something was off came around midnight. She was restocking the cabinets when she heard it, a faint creak, like a door slowly opening. She froze, listening intently. But the sound didn't come again. Shrugging it off as a settling building, she returned to her work. But then it happened again. This time, it was followed by a soft click, like a latch being closed. Claire stepped into the hallway, peering in both directions. The corridor was empty, the dim emergency lights casting long shadows. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing slightly. No answer. As the hours dragged on, the noises became more frequent. Footsteps echoed faintly, always seeming to come from just around the corner. Doors creaked open and closed, though every room she checked was empty. By 2 a.m., Claire was starting to feel the weight of the strange atmosphere. She tried to focus on her work, but the sensation of being watched was impossible to shake. She caught herself glancing over her shoulder every few minutes, her nerves fraying with each passing hour. It was during one of these moments that she saw it, the shadow. She was heading back to the pharmacy with a tray of medications when movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. Turning quickly, she saw a dark figure crouched by the hazardous waste bin at the end of the hallway. Its form was indistinct, almost blending into the shadows. But it moved with an unnatural swiftness. "Hey!" Claire called out, her voice firm despite the chill running down her spine. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it seemed to sink into the ground, vanishing completely. Claire stood frozen, her heart pounding. She tried to rationalize what she'd seen, a trick of the light. Maybe her own shadow distorted by the dim hallway. But deep down, she knew better. Mia stood frozen in the pharmacy, her back pressed against the cool metal shelves as her eyes darted toward the window where the figure had been. The oppressive silence of the hospital returned, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Her chest heaved as she struggled to slow her breathing. But the memory of the bloodied man's hollow eyes wouldn't fade. "I'm losing it," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. The sound of something clattering in the hallway snapped her back to reality. It was loud. Metallic, like a gurney being pushed too quickly over uneven tiles. The noise grew louder. Closer. And she felt the floor vibrate slightly beneath her feet. She peeked out of the pharmacy, her heart pounding as her gaze swept the dim corridor. The hallway was empty. But the noise persisted. Now accompanied by faint, hurried footsteps. "Hello?" she called out, her voice cracking. The sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against her ears like a tangible weight. Then came the laughter. It started soft, almost playful, like a child's giggle echoing down the corridor. Mia's stomach twisted as the giggle grew louder, shifting in tone to something unnatural, something guttural. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. She stepped back into the pharmacy, reaching for her phone with shaking hands. Before she could dial, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into brief moments of darkness. In each flash of light, she saw it, the shadow of a figure standing in the doorway, motionless. The final flicker left the room in darkness. But the figure remained. Mia could feel its presence, the air growing colder around her. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she fumbled for the emergency flashlight in her lab coat pocket. When she clicked it on, the narrow beam illuminated the room, and the figure was gone. The gurney sound started again. But this time, it was accompanied by something else, a low, wet dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Mia's heart raced as she stepped cautiously into the hallway, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. At the far end of the corridor, the light landed on a trail of dark, glistening streaks smeared across the floor, blood. "Oh God," she whispered, the words barely audible. Her flashlight flickered again, and the sound of dragging grew louder. She turned, the beam catching movement to her left. There, emerging from a side hallway, was the man from the elevator. His hospital gown hung from his gaunt frame, soaked with fresh blood that dripped steadily onto the floor. Mia's legs trembled as she stumbled back, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The man's head tilted unnaturally to one side, his hollow eyes locking onto hers. His lips curled into a slow, unnerving smile. "Help me," he rasped, his voice layered with something inhuman, as though multiple voices spoke at once. Mia turned and ran, her shoes skidding on the slick floor. She didn't dare look back as the dragging sound followed her, growing louder, faster. The lights above her flickered in rhythm with her pounding heart, casting warped shadows along the walls. She reached the elevator bank and slammed the button repeatedly, praying for the doors to open. The dragging noise stopped, and for a brief moment, there was silence. Then she heard it, the flute. A single, haunting note echoed down the hallway, low and mournful. Her head snapped toward the sound. And there he was again, the man, standing at the end of the hall, the blood trailing behind him like a crimson path. This time, he held something in his hand. It was a staff, or perhaps a pole, adorned with dangling objects that looked like surgical tools. They swayed with an invisible breeze, clinking together softly. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open. Mia turned to step inside, but the light inside the elevator flickered, and her blood ran cold. The reflection in the mirrored walls wasn't hers. It was his. She stumbled back. The elevator doors closing with a quiet hiss. She was trapped. The man began to move toward her. His jerky, unnatural steps growing faster with each passing second. The flute's melody grew louder, and the air around her felt suffocating, as though the hospital itself was alive, feeding off her fear. Desperation took over. Mia bolted toward the stairwell, throwing the door open with all her strength. The heavy metal door slammed behind her, and she took the stairs 2 at a time, her breath ragged. As she ascended, the sound of the dragging followed her, impossibly loud in the narrow stairwell. She glanced over her shoulder, and her heart seized. The man was there, climbing the stairs with unnatural speed, his movements contorted and inhuman. "Stay away," she screamed, her voice echoing in the confined space. But he didn't stop. She burst onto the rooftop, the cool night air hitting her like a slap. The city lights stretched out before her, but they felt impossibly far away. She spun around, her back to the edge. As the stairwell door creaked open, the man stepped out, his figure silhouetted against the dim glow of the rooftop lights. His bloodied gown fluttered faintly in the breeze, and his hollow eyes gleamed with something dark and malevolent. Mia's foot slipped on the slick rooftop surface, and she fell to her knees. The man took another step closer, raising a hand toward her. "Why won't you help me?" he rasped, his voice filled with agony and accusation. "I can't," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how." The man stopped, his head tilting as though considering her words. For a brief moment, the flute's melody softened, almost mournful. Then he took another step, and Mia squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the end. But nothing came. When she opened her eyes, the man was gone. The rooftop was empty, save for the faint sound of the wind. By the time Claire's shift ended at 7 a.m., she felt like a shell of herself. The hospital seemed to come alive with the bustle of the morning staff. But for Claire, the warmth and familiarity of daylight did little to dispel the chill that had settled in her bones. She recounted the night's events to her supervisor, who offered a half smile and a shrug. "Long shifts can mess with your mind," they said. But Claire knew what she'd seen. Later that day, unable to shake the experience, she returned to the hospital to speak with the security team. She asked about the man in the hospital gown, describing his face and the badge he'd worn. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, one of them spoke. "That sounds like Mark," he said. "He was a patient here years ago. He didn't make it. Passed away after a bad fall." Claire stared at him, her stomach twisting. "People say he never really left," the guard added. "Fourth floor was his favorite place to wander." That night, as Claire drove home, she glanced up at the hospital. In one of the windows on the 4th floor, she swore she saw a figure watching her, a faint silhouette, still and silent. Story 5: The Basement Intruder. The night was supposed to be uneventful. With her husband away on a business trip, Rachel planned to spend the weekend catching up on her favorite shows, curled up with a glass of wine. The neighborhood was quiet, the soft hum of crickets filling the warm summer air. By midnight, she'd locked the doors, turned off the lights, and settled into bed, her phone within reach. That's when she heard it, the faint sound of knocking. It wasn't loud or urgent. Just a soft, rhythmic tap 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 that seemed to come from the front door. Rachel froze, her heart pounding. She waited, straining to hear over the pounding in her ears. When the knocking came again, this time louder, she crept to the window. The front porch was empty. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself, forcing a nervous laugh. But then it happened again. This time at the side of the house. Tap tap tap. Rachel's unease deepened as she reached for her phone. Whoever was out there wasn't leaving. By the end of the night, Rachel would realize the danger wasn't just outside her home, it was already inside. Would you have checked the basement door? Or would you have run before the knocking stopped? Rachel's fingers trembled as she dialed her neighbor, Lisa, who lived 2 houses down. "Hey," Rachel said, trying to keep her voice calm. "Are you awake?" Lisa yawned on the other end. "It's late. What's wrong?" "I think someone's outside," Rachel whispered. "What do you mean? Did you see anyone?" "No, but I keep hearing knocking. First, it was at the front door. Then the side." Lisa hesitated. "Do you want me to call the police?" Rachel glanced at the clock. It was nearly 1 a.m. She didn't want to overreact. But the thought of being alone while someone lurked outside made her stomach churn. "No, not yet. Maybe it's just, I don't know, a prank or something." "Well, keep your phone close," Lisa said. "And don't open the door for anyone." After hanging up, Rachel double-checked all the locks, her footsteps echoing in the silent house. The taps had stopped, and the night seemed calm again. She let out a shaky breath and returned to the living room. She had barely sat down when the doorbell rang. Rachel's heart leapt into her throat. The sound was sharp and jarring, cutting through the stillness. This time, she didn't hesitate. She rushed to the window, carefully pulling back the curtain just enough to see. The porch was empty. A cold chill ran down her spine. Was someone playing a cruel game? Or was it something more sinister? The doorbell rang again, followed by a soft tapping on the window beside her. Rachel jumped, backing away from the curtain. Her phone was already in her hand, her fingers hovering over the keypad. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice wavering. No answer. Her stomach twisted as she moved through the house, checking the windows and peering into the darkness outside. The tapping continued intermittently, always at a different spot. It was as if someone, or something, was circling the house, testing her nerves. Then came the sound that made her blood run cold. The unmistakable creak of the basement door. Rachel huddled in the corner of her bedroom, the phone pressed to her ear as the 911 operator's voice cut through the static of her terror. She tried to focus on the instructions, but her mind was racing, caught between the pounding of her heart and the sound of footsteps creeping down the hallway. "Stay calm, ma'am," the operator said. "The officers are en route. Can you secure yourself further?" Rachel stared at the bedroom door. The soft creak of the floorboards outside confirmed it. Someone, or something, was there. She slid a heavy dresser in front of the door, the wood scraping loudly against the floor. She froze, hoping the noise wouldn't provoke whatever was on the other side. The footsteps stopped. For a brief moment, silence reigned. Then came the whisper, low and guttural, "Rachel." Her blood turned to ice. The voice was raspy, almost playful, stretching her name into a chilling drawl. "Who's there?" she called out. her voice cracking. The only response was a soft tapping on the door. Rhythmic and deliberate. She backed away, clutching the phone tighter, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Rachel. Are you still with me?" the operator asked. "They're outside my door," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Officers are 2 minutes away. Stay where you are. Do not engage," the operator said firmly. Suddenly, the tapping stopped, replaced by a heavy, scraping noise, as though something sharp was being dragged down the length of the door. Rachel's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, unable to tear her eyes away from the door handle, which began to jiggle ever so slightly. The sound of the scraping intensified, and Rachel could feel it reverberating in her chest. It was no longer coming just from the door, it was everywhere, as if the walls themselves were groaning under the weight of an unseen force. Her breathing hitched as a shadow passed under the door. Whatever was out there wasn't leaving. Then, with a loud thud, something slammed against the door. The dresser rattled, and Rachel screamed, scrambling backward until her back hit the wall. The pounding came again, harder this time, as if the intruder were throwing their entire weight against the barrier. Rachel gripped the phone with trembling hands. "Please hurry," she begged the operator. "They're pulling into your street now," the operator assured her. But Rachel wasn't sure she had a minute to spare. The pounding stopped, replaced by a different sound, a metallic clinking, faint and methodical. It took her a moment to realize what it was, the sound of keys jangling. Rachel's eyes widened in horror as she remembered something her husband had said earlier that week: "The spare key is in the basement, behind the toolbox. Just in case." "No," she whispered, shaking her head. The jangling grew louder, and then she heard the click of the lock disengaging. The door inched open, the heavy dresser sliding forward as if pushed by an inhuman force. Rachel screamed and threw herself against the far wall, clutching a lamp like a weapon. The door creaked, opening just enough to reveal a sliver of the hallway, and the dark figure standing on the other side. It was tall, its head bent at an unnatural angle. The faint glow from the streetlight outside illuminated its silhouette, but its face remained obscured in shadow. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, and Rachel could see its hand reaching through the crack in the door, its fingers impossibly long and spindly. "You're finally home," it whispered, the voice cold and dripping with malice. Rachel threw the lamp, the sound of shattering glass piercing the suffocating tension. The figure recoiled, retreating momentarily as she scrambled to her feet. At that moment, red and blue lights flashed outside the bedroom window, and she heard the distant sound of car doors slamming. Relief surged through her as she screamed, "Up here! I'm up here!" But the figure didn't flee. Instead, it stood motionless in the hallway, its shadow stretching impossibly long, as if mocking her sense of safety. The pounding on the front door startled her. "Police! Open up!" The figure turned slowly, its head twisting toward the sound. Then, with an unnatural fluidity, it melted into the shadows, disappearing into the house. Rachel waited, her body trembling, until the officers burst into her bedroom, weapons drawn. She collapsed into their arms, sobbing as she tried to explain what had happened. The officers searched the house from top to bottom, their flashlights sweeping every corner. But they found nothing. The basement door was ajar, the spare key still in its hiding spot behind the toolbox. No windows were broken, No locks tampered with. One officer knelt beside her. His expression serious. "It's possible someone got in through an unlocked window and left when we arrived," he said. Rachel shook her head. No. It wasn't just someone. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner but said nothing. Before they left, Rachel asked if she could stay somewhere else for the night. The officer nodded. "That's probably a good idea. We'll keep an eye on the house." Rachel packed a small bag. But before leaving, she stood at the top of the basement stairs, staring into the darkness below. The whispers were gone, but the oppressive feeling lingered. Like a warning. She turned away, closing the door firmly behind her. But as she locked it, she couldn't shake the feeling that whoever, or whatever, had been in her home wasn't done with her. Would you have stayed another night in that house? Or would you have left the moment you heard the basement door creak? Rachel's grip on her phone tightened as she dialed 911. Her trembling fingers barely able to press the buttons. The operator's calm voice was a stark contrast to the terror gripping her. "There's someone in my house," Rachel whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Stay on the line," the operator said. "Officers are on their way." The footsteps stopped outside her door. Rachel could hear her own heartbeat, loud and frantic, as she stared at the doorknob, waiting for it to turn. But it didn't. Instead, there was a low, guttural laugh. It was faint, almost a whisper, but it sent chills through her entire body. Then silence. The police arrived minutes later, bursting into the house with flashlights and weapons drawn. They found no one. The basement was empty, the windows locked, and there were no signs of forced entry. But the basement door had been open. One officer pulled Rachel aside, his expression serious. "It's possible the intruder came in through an unlocked window and left when they heard us coming," he said. "We'll patrol the area. But you should stay somewhere else tonight." Rachel nodded. But the explanation didn't ease her fear. As she packed a bag to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that whoever, or whatever, had been in her house wasn't gone for good. Before leaving, she glanced at the basement door one last time. It was closed now, but the chair she'd wedged under the knob had been moved. Would you have gone down to the basement? Or would you have fled the moment you heard the knocking? Story 6: The Lost Explorer. The Pacific Crest Trail spans 2.650 miles of rugged wilderness. From the sun-scorched deserts of California to the snow-capped peaks of Washington. It's a dream for adventurers, but also a test of endurance, skill, and survival for seasoned hiker Chris Monroe. It was the ultimate challenge, a journey meticulously planned and eagerly anticipated. Chris wasn't just another outdoor enthusiast. A former military man turned avid explorer. He had years of hiking experience, a reputation for careful preparation, and a deep respect for nature's unpredictability. Every piece of gear was chosen with precision, every route logged, and every mile documented. He updated his family and friends regularly, ensuring they always knew his general location. But in May 2018, during a section hike in Northern California, Chris vanished without a trace. There was no distress signal, no signs of struggle, no abandoned gear. It was as if the wilderness itself had swallowed him whole. The search that followed was extensive, involving helicopters, tracking dogs, and volunteers scouring miles of trail. Yet, not a single clue emerged. What happened to Chris Monroe? A tragic accident? A sinister encounter? Or something far stranger? Lurking in the heart of the wilderness? Would you dare venture into the unknown, knowing you might never return? Chris's journey on the Pacific Crest Trail, PCT, began in early April. As spring thawed the higher elevations, he kept a steady pace, sharing breathtaking photos of misty valleys, ancient forests, and snow-dusted peaks. By mid-May, he had reached the rugged Castle Crags Wilderness in Northern California, a place known for its jagged granite spires and dense, labyrinthine forests. His last known contact was a text message to a fellow hiker, making camp near Crags tomorrow. Should hit Lassen next week. When Chris failed to check in as scheduled, concern quickly turned to alarm. His parents contacted the Shasta County Sheriff's Department, who launched a search and rescue operation. Helicopters scanned the area from above, while teams on foot scoured the trail and surrounding terrain. Trained tracking dogs were brought in, sniffing for any sign of Chris's scent. But the search turned up nothing. Chris's campsite near Castle Crags was undisturbed, with no signs of a struggle or a hasty departure. His GPS device and maps were missing. But that wasn't unusual, he likely had them with him. What was strange, however, was the absence of any trail. No broken branches, no footprints, no discarded items. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. Speculation began to swirl. Some believed Chris had taken a wrong turn and fallen victim to the rugged terrain, a hidden crevasse, a sudden rock slide, or an unmarked drop. Others suggested foul play, pointing to the transient communities and isolated areas along the PCT where encounters can turn dangerous. But those who knew Chris doubted both theories. He was too experienced to get lost and too cautious to trust strangers easily. Then there were the whispers, stories of hikers who had disappeared in the wilderness under eerily similar circumstances. Unseen forces, unnatural phenomena, the call of the wild that lured people to their doom. Weeks into the search, hope was fading fast. The area near Castle Crags Wilderness had been combed over multiple times. Helicopters had flown grid patterns across the jagged peaks, and tracking dogs had sniffed out every possible trail. Yet the search teams had nothing, no footprints, no scraps of clothing, no gear. For experienced search and rescue workers, it was an anomaly that defied logic. Even when someone's lost for years, we usually find something, one volunteer said. The wilderness doesn't erase people completely. But this feels different. The wilderness seemed almost defiant. Its labyrinthine trails and shadowy forests whispering secrets it refused to share. Some searchers reported an unsettling feeling of being watched, as though the trees themselves had eyes. One day, a tracker named Marcus ventured deeper into an unsearched canyon. He was an experienced hiker, someone who prided himself on his ability to read the terrain. But as he descended, the air grew heavy, the sunlight dimming unnaturally despite the cloudless sky. Marcus paused, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. Then he saw it, a flash of movement in his peripheral vision. "Chris," he called out, his voice echoing off the rocky walls. No response. He followed the movement, his heart pounding as he approached a dense thicket. The undergrowth was unnaturally still, the usual hum of insects eerily absent. Pushing through the brush, Marcus found himself in a small clearing. At its center stood a tree unlike any he'd seen before, its bark twisted and blackened, its branches stretching skyward like skeletal hands. There was something wedged in the roots, a single hiking boot, weathered but intact. The discovery reignited the search, but it only deepened the mystery. The boot matched Chris Monroe's size and brand. But it was pristine, as though untouched by time. Search teams returned to the clearing. But despite scouring the area, they found nothing else. Theories grew darker. What if he didn't leave? One searcher whispered. What if the forest took him? It sounded absurd. But the eerie atmosphere of the Castle Crags wilderness made even the most rational minds waver. Veteran hikers spoke of the wilderness call, a phenomenon where people suddenly wander off, as if compelled by an unseen force. Chris's case gained new life online, with forums dissecting every detail of his disappearance. Some claimed he had stumbled into a hidden cave system, lured by strange noises echoing through the rock. Others suggested he'd crossed into another dimension, lost to a realm where the rules of time and space didn't apply. And then there were the locals, who spoke of older, darker stories, legends of the wilderness itself as a sentient entity, one that sometimes demanded sacrifices. Months later, a hiker named Sarah Jensen ventured into the area. She wasn't looking for Chris, she didn't even know his story. But one night, while camping near Castle Crags, she awoke to the sound of humming. It was faint at first, a low, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate through the ground. She sat up in her tent, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The humming grew louder, accompanied by a strange rustling in the trees. When she unzipped the tent and stepped outside, she saw them, figures moving in the distance, their forms shadowy and indistinct. They walked in unison, their movements jerky, as though controlled by invisible strings. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The figures stopped. For a moment, the forest was deathly silent. Then one of them turned its head, and Sarah's blood ran cold. It wasn't a face she recognized, but it was undeniably human. The figure's eyes were hollow, its expression blank, and its skin seemed stretched too tightly over its skull. Before she could move, the humming intensified, and the figures vanished into the trees. Sarah fled the next morning, leaving her gear behind. When she reported the incident to local authorities, they dismissed it as a trick of the light, perhaps combined with exhaustion. But the details of her story made their way online, and hikers began to whisper, could one of the figures have been Chris Monroe? The forest gave no answers. Searchers eventually scaled back their efforts, citing the lack of evidence and the growing danger of the terrain. Chris Monroe's family was left with nothing but questions, and a haunting sense that the wilderness had chosen their son for reasons they'd never understand. Even now, hikers passing through Castle Crags speak of strange noises and fleeting shadows, as though the wilderness itself remembers. Sometimes, the forest doesn't just take, it keeps. 5 years later, Chris Monroe's case remains unsolved. The trail near Castle Crags remains popular, but hikers speak in hushed tones about the man who disappeared without a trace. Some avoid the area altogether, spooked by the stories that now cling to it like mist on the peaks. The wilderness offers no answers, no bones, no gear, no journal detailing his final days. Just an oppressive silence that seems almost mocking. For Chris's parents, the pain is twofold, the loss of their son and the haunting uncertainty of his fate. It's the not knowing, his mother once said in an interview. I just want to bring him home. But for others, the story of Chris Monroe serves as a grim reminder of the wilderness's power. The PCT is beautiful, but it is also vast, remote, and indifferent. For all our preparation, all our expertise, Nature remains untamed and unforgiving. Sometimes, the forest takes what it wants. Story 7: The Gallatin Forest Murder. The wilderness is where many seek peace, a sanctuary of quiet and solitude. Far removed from the chaos of civilization. For Ethan Grant, a freelance journalist and avid camper, Gallatin National Forest was the perfect place to work on his latest article. Nestled in Montana's sprawling wilderness, the forest promised inspiration and isolation. But solitude has its risks. When hikers found Ethan's lifeless body near the banks of the Gallatin River, the scene painted a horrifying picture. His throat had been slashed, his body riddled with stab wounds, and the blood-soaked ground bore signs of a violent struggle. Nearby, his campsite lay abandoned, a camp chair overturned, and a small fire pit still smoldering. The community was shocked. Gallatin National Forest, known for its stunning beauty, now bore the dark stain of a brutal crime. What followed was a web of chilling clues, a suspect with a violent history, blood evidence tying him to the murder, and a chilling claim of self-defense. Yet the inconsistencies in his story hinted at something far more sinister, a calculated act of violence hidden in the guise of survival. Would you camp alone, knowing the wilderness isn't always empty? Ethan Grant was no novice to the outdoors. His friends described him as meticulous and cautious, the type of person who double-checked every detail before embarking on a trip. He carried a well-stocked pack, including emergency gear, and he always informed someone of his whereabouts. When Ethan set off for Gallatin National Forest in mid-August, he was excited about his newest article, exploring the growing trend of solo wilderness camping. He had chosen a remote area, far from the usual trails and campsites, to immerse himself fully in the experience. 3 days later, hikers stumbled upon the grisly scene. Ethan's body lay sprawled near the riverbank, his hands bloodied from what appeared to be a desperate fight. Investigators noted multiple stab wounds and deep gashes, but it was the slash across his throat that had ended his life. His journal was found nearby. Its last entry abruptly cut off: "A man approached my camp today. Looked rough. Asked for." The discovery of a bloodied hunting knife partially submerged in the river provided the first tangible lead. Forensic analysis confirmed that the blood on the blade matched Ethan's, and muddy footprints leading away from the scene hinted at a hurried departure. Witness accounts soon pointed investigators toward Thomas Blake, a transient known to frequent the area. Blake had a reputation for aggression. He'd been seen arguing with hikers, demanding food and supplies, and even threatening those who refused. On the day of Ethan's murder, 2 hikers reported a disturbing encounter with a man matching Blake's description: disheveled, erratic, and carrying a large backpack. The courtroom was silent as Thomas Blake recounted his version of events. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease as he described the supposed altercation. "I didn't want trouble," Blake said, his gaze darting toward the jury. "But he came at me first. I was scared. It was him or me." The prosecutor leaned forward, his tone calm but cutting. "You expect us to believe that Ethan Grant, a man known for his calm demeanor and generosity, attacked you out of nowhere?" Blake hesitated. He wasn't calm that night. Something set him off. "Or perhaps you're the one who wasn't calm," the prosecutor countered, raising a photograph of Ethan's injuries. The image was grisly: stab wounds on his chest and arms, defensive cuts on his hands. These wounds tell a different story. They show a man fighting for his life against someone who intended to kill. The jury murmured, the weight of the evidence sinking in. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that unraveled Blake's story, it was the chilling psychological undertones that emerged as the trial continued. The prosecution introduced testimony from 2 hikers who had encountered Blake just days before the murder. He was sitting by the trail, staring at nothing, one witness recalled. When we passed, he asked for food. We didn't have much to spare. And when we said no, he got angry. Started muttering about how people like us didn't deserve to be out here. Another hiker reported an even more disturbing encounter. I saw him following me for a while, she said, her voice trembling. When I confronted him, he just smiled and said, "The woods have rules. Some of us follow them, and some of us don't." These accounts painted a picture of a man teetering on the edge, his resentment toward hikers like Ethan simmering into something darker. The prosecution's most damning evidence came from forensic analysis of Ethan's journal. The incomplete entry found at the crime scene: "A man approached my camp today. Looked rough. Asked for," took on new significance when paired with Blake's prior behavior. This entry wasn't just a casual observation, the prosecutor argued. It was a warning, a record of a threat Ethan sensed but couldn't escape. Blake's defense began to crumble when new forensic evidence emerged. A detailed analysis of the bloodied hunting knife revealed smudged fingerprints beneath the blood, prints that matched Blake's. But it wasn't just the knife that implicated him. Ethan's torn shirt bore microscopic traces of Blake's skin under the fabric, suggesting a violent struggle. The most chilling discovery, however, was the pattern of blood splatter on the riverbank. Experts testified that the angle and distribution of the blood indicated that Ethan had been on his knees, his hands raised defensively, when the fatal blow was delivered. This wasn't self-defense, the prosecutor declared. This was cold-blooded murder. Blake's demeanor shifted as the evidence mounted. During cross-examination, he grew agitated, his responses more erratic. When asked why he hadn't sought help after the supposed attack, his reply sent a chill through the courtroom. "I didn't think anyone would believe me," he said, his voice low. "Besides, the forest takes care of its own." The statement hung in the air, its cryptic nature unsettling. "What do you mean by that, Mr. Blake?" the prosecutor pressed. Blake smirked, his eyes distant. "You wouldn't understand." The final days of the trial were marked by a palpable tension. The jury deliberated for hours, weighing the mountain of evidence against the eerie undercurrent of Blake's testimony. When the verdict was delivered, guilty of second-degree murder, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and unease. Blake showed no emotion as he was led away, but his parting words to the courtroom sent a shiver down the spines of all who heard them. "You think it's over. But the forest doesn't forget. It'll call someone else next." The conviction brought closure for Ethan Grant's family, but it left a haunting legacy for Gallatin National Forest. Campers and hikers began sharing stories of eerie experiences near the riverbank where Ethan was killed. Some claimed to hear faint whispers at night, while others spoke of an oppressive feeling, as if unseen eyes were watching them. For those who knew the forest's beauty, the events of that August forever changed how they saw it. The wilderness, once a place of peace, now bore the weight of a violent past, and the unsettling idea that it might have played a role in what happened. Blake was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. For many, the verdict brought closure, but the shadows of what happened in Gallatin National Forest lingered. Ethan's friends and family remembered him as a man who loved nature's beauty and sought to share its wonders through his writing. His death served as a grim reminder of the risks inherent in the wilderness, not just from nature itself, but from the people who wander its edges. The forest, vast and unyielding, remains a place of mystery. For all its beauty, it is a space where solitude can turn dangerous, and where human nature can become its own kind of predator. Visitors to Gallatin National Forest occasionally leave flowers at the site where Ethan was found, a silent tribute to a life cut short. But the questions linger. What if Blake hadn't been caught? What if Ethan's journal had been completed? And perhaps the most chilling thought of all, what other dangers hide in the places we deem most serene? Would you camp alone, knowing the wilderness doesn't always promise safety? The trial may have ended, but the questions surrounding Ethan Grant's tragic death linger like a shadow over Gallatin National Forest. Was Thomas Blake's rage born entirely of desperation and anger? Or was there something deeper, a sinister force in the wilderness that stoked the fire? For those who have ventured near the riverbank where Ethan was killed, the forest has never felt the same. Campers whisper of strange sounds at night, low murmurs that carry on the wind, and the rustling of leaves when the air is still. Some claim to see fleeting shadows just beyond the firelight, too large and swift to be animals. Blake's chilling final words still haunt those who heard them. The forest doesn't forget. Could he have meant more than a metaphor? Was his crime entirely human? Or could the wilderness itself play a role in tipping the balance? As you close this chapter, ask yourself, what secrets does the wilderness keep? Is it simply an untamed expanse of nature? Or does it hold memories of those who vanish within its borders? Here at Wolf Tells, we delve into the unexplained, the eerie, and the stories that leave us questioning everything we thought we knew. Ethan's story is a reminder that even the most serene places can hold unfathomable darkness. But the forest doesn't just whisper warnings, it calls others back. Could the next story come from your favorite trail? Or perhaps one you've yet to explore? If this tale gripped you as much as it did us, let us know in the comments below. What do you think truly happened to Ethan Grant? Could the wilderness itself be a player in this tragedy? And if you've ever had a chilling experience in the wild, don't keep it to yourself, we'd love to hear it. Before you go, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wolf Tells. It helps us bring you more stories that send shivers down your spine. Turn on notifications, so you'll be the first to hear our next tale of mystery and dread. Thank you for watching. And remember, the forest has eyes, and stories waiting to be told. See you in the next video.